You don't know if you can hold it in any longer. It's just building and building and building and building. And then a lot of times what happens, sometimes we call this passive-aggressive behavior, by the way, where you don't say anything and it just builds and builds and builds, and then finally there's an explosion that happens. Somebody lashes out or it sets up a terse conversation, and there's a long list of offenses that are recited in no uncertain terms. Now, I have done this, where stuff builds and builds and builds. And so I finally said, I've got to say something to them. But rather than talking about one thing or two things, I find myself with a laundry list of things about them that really frustrate me, and I end up dumping the whole load. Anybody want to know how good that goes? Not very well at all. And I have done that far too many times. Because then when I start to unload my stuff, all the things that I'm frustrated about, the other person tends to get defensive, and then what they do is they pull out a list on me. Can you believe anybody would have anything on their list about me? Well, I guess if two of you thought confrontation equaled me, I guess that's true. But basically what you got is charges and countercharges. They're flying around the room. It's like the gunfight at the OK Corral. Guilt, blame, shame, that all used as ammunition. And people who have better verbal skills usually come out, it seems like, the winners of the argument. But you can win an argument and lose the relationship, can't you? You can be absolutely right, at least from your perspective, say you really came on and you told them what, and boy, you laid it on the line and all that kind of thing happened. But many times the relationship is never what it was before, after you've had one of those encounters. And because of that, if we've had that experience a few times, it's no wonder that people are reluctant to confront anybody about important issues. I'm just not going to ever bring anything up again. We're never going to talk about anything again because it's not worth all the stuff that can happen as a result of having the conversation. Now, we talked in the very first session about different kind of responses. We have attack responses, remember, and we have escape responses. Those of us who tend to use the attack responses to conflict, we bite our lips till they almost bleed because we feel like something needs to be said, but we just don't want to go there again. Those who have a tendency to use escape responses to conflict withdraw and even hide rather than having to be around somebody who is just so irritating. So we make that decision, say, you know what, it's just not worth it. I'm going to steer clear of them. And I think I even described one church that we were in where people would literally walk into the worship center. They would look around to see who was sitting where so that they would know where to sit in order to avoid having any eye contact or any possibility of having any kind of conversation with them. Both attack and escape type responders tend to vent their frustration to other people. So we're not talking to the people that we should be talking to. We start talking to other people. And of course, that is known as what? As gossip. Another word there is slander. So we're frustrated with somebody else, and rather than talking directly to them, and maybe it's because we've had some bad situations in the past, we talk to other people about it, and that's called gossip and slander. And we, rather than releasing the tension, this is just building up so much, I just had to talk to somebody about it. Rather than releasing the tension, it actually stirs up more strife. And it also builds anger and bitterness inside of us. We're like that pot, all the holes are covered, and it just builds and builds and builds, and eventually there's going to be some kind of an explosion. But before that happens, it's internalized. And that's where bitterness comes into play. It's really a sad thing. Matthew 18:15. Is the whole, Matthew 18 is often referred to as the chapter that deals with church discipline. And when we kind of read Matthew 18:15, if you got something against a brother, you go to him, it says. And so we can think that the only way to approach any situation is through direct confrontation. That is, we're going to go, and our goal is to force that person to admit that they sinned. That's our goal. We're going to point it out, and hopefully they're going to pick it up that they did something wrong. But when we look at the more of the context of Matthew chapter 18, we see that Jesus had something a lot different in mind altogether. And so we got to see it in terms of its context. Just before this passage, Jesus used the metaphor of a loving shepherd looking for wandering sheep. Now, hopefully you've been around here long enough for these to know that we do little Bible drills. This is our little Awana on Sunday nights. So I want somebody, if you would, to read chapter 18, Matthew 18, verses 12 through 14. And so what's the motive of the shepherd there when he goes after that sheep? Is it to find it and really whip it into shape? Whap, 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 whap. How dare you tear away from the flock like that? You little lamb, you know, that kind of a thing. Obviously it's not. What's the motive behind that? To save him. He wants to bring the sheep back into the fold. It's the motivation of a shepherd. And what does the shepherd do when he finds the sheep? He rejoices. They celebrate because his goal all along has been to bring the sheep back. The context is one of restoration. It's not one of condemnation. It's about winning somebody. It's about saving them. It's about helping them. It's about forgiving your brother. Now, Matthew 18, 21 through 35 is the parable of the unmerciful servant, and I think it's worth reading tonight. I read it again today and was gripped by how powerful the passage is. So, chapter 18, 21 to 35, another parable of Jesus, but this one is really pointed. Who's going to read that? Boy, you put those two things in that context of discipline and you begin to see it in a whole different light, don't you? It's not about slapping somebody around. It's not about just confronting them with their sin because we want to do it. The whole thing has to do with that motive, and the motive is one of mercy. The one is desire to restore a broken relationship, and where sin is involved, there is a pleading part of that where we're very concerned about them. So he's calling us to forgiveness. He's calling us to mercy. He's calling us to something more loving and redemptive than blunt confrontation. We're functioning like a shepherd, Now, there certainly are situations that call for direct confrontation and even what we often call righteous indignation. And anytime somebody gets mad, a Christian gets mad, usually they want to justify it by talking about Jesus driving the people out of the temple. Well, just like Jesus got mad and he took the whip and he drove the money changers out of the temple, that means that I can explode over this issue. Those were certainly extreme cases that were handled, by the way, by Jesus. It first of all really helps that he was omniscient, okay, because he could not only see the actions, but he could see the motivations behind the actions. He himself was completely righteous and holy, and so there was nothing in his character that would keep him from confronting this situation. His facts were always straight. His perception of people was flawless. His motives were completely pure, and his life was totally blameless. Jesus taught and modeled, however, gentler approaches rather than simply harsh confrontation. And there are actually several scriptural examples of gentler approaches. We might even call them indirect approaches rather than blunt confrontation. I think Jesus demonstrated that a couple of weeks ago when we talked about the Samaritan woman at the well. He didn't just, walk up to her and say, "You adulteress, you. What in the world are you doing with your life? You're destroying your life." That's not where he started. He engaged her in dialogue. He engaged her in a process of assessing her life. Paul, preaching on Mars Hill with the Athenians, and here's all of these idols around everywhere. And again, we see him engaging, first of all, at a point of common interest, and then he moves gradually to sharing the gospel. That's from Acts chapter 17. And of course, the first thing he does is he basically compliments them, doesn't he? Boy, you people are really religious. You people are really spiritual. I can see that you take spiritual things very seriously. I can see that because of all these idols that you have got around here. And then he moves on and he says, but I want to talk to you about one specific one of your idols, and that is the one to the unknown God. and that's the one I want to talk to you about. And so we find Jesus taking a very wise approach, not just Paul here, not clubbing somebody over the head from the get-go. I think another great example of this is Esther. The book of Esther is a wonderful book. In Esther 5 through 7, you know the issue that she was dealing with was that the king was basically tricked into making a decree that all Jews had to be killed. And he didn't know that his wife, the latest queen, was actually a Jewess. And so she knew that she needed to talk to her husband. She needed to talk to the king about this issue. But it took her 2 days and 2 banquets to get around to it, okay? She really set the stage well. She was very careful about the way that she approached this very sensitive issue. And so when we're going into a difficult conversation that may have an element of confrontation in it, it's very important that we seek discernment. We ask God for it. We even ask some other people about perhaps the best way to approach this, to find the most winsome and effective way to approach somebody when we know there's going to be a difficult conversation. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Back in 1973, David Augsburger wrote a book called Caring Enough to Confront, and he's the one who actually first coined that term, carefrontation, kind of taking the idea of confrontation and putting the word care with it, carefrontation. And that word has actually been used in counseling situations, in management situations, leadership training venues. It isn't about getting something off of my chest. Now, sometimes that's a lead-in, too. And by the way, I've heard this used in congregational meetings, too, but I've also heard it in other venues where people say, there's something I've been wanting to say for a long time. I just got to get this off my chest. And you might as well just duck and cover at that point, right? Because you know what's about to be said is going to be harsh. It's going to be offensive to some people, and it's probably not going to bring anybody closer together, is it? It's probably going to polarize and divide because the focus is primarily on the person. It's primarily on me at that point. So it's not about that. It has to do with ministering to somebody who has some blind spots, has gotten off track, or needs help to get back on track. There's a good Bible word for this, by the way. The word is called admonish. Admonish. Somebody read for us Colossians 3:16. I like that, Nancy, because it almost seems like you might want to get some music involved in this whole thing. Yeah. But do something that kind of creates that atmosphere because you're going to share some important things, but you want to do what you can to create a healthy atmosphere to admonish someone. What does it mean to admonish in wisdom? First of all, a wise admonisher remembers the goal of admonishment. It is to keep a brother or sister in Christ on track. It is for their benefit. Admonishment brings attention to a debilitating behavior, and it opens the way for change. Admonishment is different than criticism because criticism often comes across as tearing somebody down. Admonishing is to build them up. That's the motive behind to admonish. It is to build them up in some way. A second wise admonisher asks, am I the best person to do this? Sometimes there are issues that are there, and they've been building your things you've been thinking for a while. And sometimes you will be the best person to have that conversation, but in other cases, maybe somebody else should do it. Would they be able to hear this better from someone else? Especially if you are, for example, if you're in a small group and you have someone who's kind of dominating the conversation with their opinions or telling their story every week and kind of dominating the sharing time with all the stuff that's going on in their life and not giving everybody else an opportunity to kind of interact, and that's kind of building up at that point. And you say, okay, I wonder if that should come from me or if it should come from somebody else in the group. But that's a legitimate question to ask. Third, a wise admonisher rehearses the admonishment so that it is presented tactfully and sensitively as possible. I like the way that Ken Sande puts it in the book. He says, tact is making a point without making an enemy. It's attacking the problem rather than attacking the person. When you put encouragement and correction together, you get tact. Fourth, a wise admonisher admonishes personally and face-to-face rather than an anonymous note, an email, or a text. I'll share something real recent and real practical, and I'm not whining, honestly. But last week, I got what we used to call this missiles. And missiles usually came in the form of connection cards. This person, what they wrote, they didn't even put on a connection card. They put it on another piece of paper. And it was a pretty direct shot at me about two things. No name, so there's nobody to talk to, right? Who do I go back and talk? I suppose I could get a handwriting specialist to find out who wrote the note. And the things that were brought up were pretty blunt, and they were pretty personal. And so, they hit a little bit, but one of the most frustrating things is how do you respond to that? There may be something legitimate that they're thinking or feeling in that whole thing, that if we were to have a conversation, we may be able to have some dialogue about those issues. And maybe there's some things that they had to say to me that I really needed to hear. But in that form, in that anonymous form, in the missiles, the guided missiles, they don't help. They only hurt. And so that's why in this passage we're looking at in Matthew 18:15, if you got a problem with somebody, you don't put an anonymous note on a connection card, do you? You don't kind of whisper it to somebody else and hope, called triangulation. We've talked about that a few times. There's something that I want to say to you. So I tell somebody close to you and say, could you pass this on to them? That's not the way to do it. If we have an issue with somebody, the Bible says we need to go to them, right? Face to face, so they can see who it is that has the problem, that has the issue with them. Carefrontation can include a few things. So, carefrontation, as we're calling it, can include confession. In that case, Marianne, it may be you saying, I have to confess to you I struggle with this. It could include instruction. It could include reasoning, encouragement, correction, warning, rebuking. There's a few things that can be involved in this. And I think this is a good point, and that is we adjust the intensity of the communication to fit the other person's position and the urgency of the situation. How big of a deal is this? How big of a deal is this? And if it's a fairly minor thing, in the big scope of things, it's a fairly minor thing, then a lot of times it can be handled in a very casual conversation. But if it's something that has bigger implications than that, then I think we especially need to work hard to make sure that we're doing it in a setting and approaching it in a way that's going to be most redemptive. That goes back to that tact issue that we were saying before. Couple of passages. I need a 1 Timothy 5:1 and a Titus 1:13. 1 Timothy 5:1, thank you. And then the other, somebody else do Titus 1:13. Sometimes there's an intensity about the situation where we do need to make sure that we're communicating very clearly and that this offense is a very serious offense. The thing is, we don't want our discussion, our disagreements to degenerate into quarreling, arguing, or foolish controversies. Now, there are a few verses that I want you to hear on this one. Somebody look at Philippians 2:14. Thank you, Lauren. Somebody else, 2 Timothy 2:23 and 24. Thank you, Val. And then somebody else, Titus 3:9. Thank you. Quarreling rarely accomplishes anything. How long has it been since you've been in a good religious argument? And as we like to say, that usually produce a lot more heat than light, right? There's not much new information that's brought to the table in that, and that controversy actually creates more problem. And that's why we're using words like carefrontation. Ken Sande suggests 4 occasions that call for loving confrontation or carefrontation of fellow believers. So let's look at these. First of all, when their actions are dishonoring God. Their actions are dishonoring God. Somehow things that they're doing or things that they're saying are causing people to think less of God, thinking less of His church, thinking less of His word. And it may be through slander, for example, spreading stories. They're doing things that when the world hears about that, when the people hear about that, God is dishonored. The whole cause of Christ is being dishonored because of what this person is doing or what they're saying. Second occasion that he says we need to think about carefrontation, and that is when their actions or attitudes are damaging your relationship with them. Damaging your relationship with them. And you can't get it out of your mind. Sometimes, and I think it's always, there's always wisdom in, first of all, saying, now, is this that big a deal? Is this just me? Am I overreacting? Maybe you have conversations with yourself like that on occasion. But then you finally come to a place and say, I just can't get this out of my mind. It just keeps coming up over and over again. I can't get it out. Your feelings, your thoughts, your words, your actions toward another person have been altered for more than a short period of time. You're thinking differently about these people than you used to think. And that is an indication that there probably needs to be some kind of a conversation with them about that because it's affecting your relationship. Even a minor offense can damage a relationship if it's done repeatedly, if it happens over and over and over again. Third occasion when there needs to be a carefrontation, and that is their belief that their behavior is hurting others. Their behavior is hurting others. Child abuse, drunk driving, gossip, angry outbursts, verbal abuse of people. Maybe you have been in a situation where you have heard someone talking to their children in very demeaning ways in public. And you can just see the kids crashing. I mean, you can see it on their faces that they're really being wounded by not only the things that they're hearing from mom or dad, but the way that they're saying it. Now, I know that this is hard stuff, but caring enough to find an opportunity to pull that person aside and just say, I just want to tell you what I observed. And I just need to talk to you about that because I think you're hurting. I think you're hurting your son. I think you're hurting your daughter. I think you're hurting your husband or your wife by the way you're talking to them or the way that you're talking about them. And so you're stepping in at that point. Other people are being led astray by following a bad example. Today, the atmosphere has changed completely. The culture has changed. But I had an uncle that was extremely abusive to his kids, but he was always considered to be a great example of a Christian dad, because when his kids were in church, they were perfectly behaved. And do you know why they were perfectly behaved? Because they had to be. And we knew that things were happening behind closed doors in the home. The leaders of the church were aware that those things were going on. And nothing was ever said to him. And part of it was the culture. Back in those days, we don't want to get involved. We don't want to meddle in anything like that. But it got to be pretty bad. And it takes some God-given courage to step into a situation like that, but you also have to do it in a way that's discerning and wise and tactful. It's not the type of thing you strike back at. Now, I've heard people say, if you see someone being demeaned like that in public, where you actually stand between that person and try to give a message that says, I'm not going to let this happen to you. Now, that's a dangerous thing, and I know that it's dangerous for the person who does that. But nevertheless, we need to be very concerned about it if the actions of other people are hurting someone else and people are being led astray by a bad example. And when these things are made public, it causes Christians to take sides. It creates division. A couple of passages here. 2 Timothy 4, 2 through 4. All right. Now with that, we usually think that's the stuff that comes from the pulpit, but at this place, there's a point for preaching that comes at that individual level too, where we're going to take those same things and saying, this person, there needs to be some kind of intervention here. We've got to intervene with the Word of God because other people are being hurt. Titus 3:10. All right, again, hurting others, people who are stirring up strife. Another passage talks about, I think from Proverbs, if you create division between intimate friends, if you step between and you cause people, their relationship to be hurt, that's a situation that is hurting other people, and somebody needs to step in at that point. And then one more, and that is when they're hurting themselves. When they're hurting themselves. Christians have a responsibility to help other people deal with debilitating sin. Galatians 6:1.